Okay, our next presenter is Tim Boring. Tim is the founder and president of Michigan Agricultural Advancement. Michigan AA empowers alternatives to the commodity ag system. He's the sixth generation to operate his family farm in Stockbridge and raises a variety of grain crops and weird stuff out there. So he currently serves on the Michigan Department of Ag and Rural Development Ag Commission. He previously served as the vice president of Michigan Agribusiness Association and research director of the Michigan Soybean Promotion Committee. He holds a MS and a PhD in crop and soil sciences from MSU. I met Tim a couple years ago at an Underground Innovations event, and I just fell in love with the whole concept because it was a bunch of producers in one room sharing stories, and it was cool. And my goal here in this county is to do anything I can to help you guys develop something like that or get together or to help you answer your questions. Tim Boring.
Thanks, Sue. I was at an Ag Commission meeting today, which is why I don't have work boots on today. There's a lot of different stuff I could talk about, and I appreciate the introduction, Sue. I'm going to basically talk about what I'm doing on my farm. I'm happy to get into like the Underground Innovations meeting and what we're trying to do with like components of this new group, this Michigan Ag Advancement. But frankly, I like talking about what I do on my farm. I guess this is the easiest way I have to start any of this sort of stuff, right? And I guess this is applicable to like the stuff I'm doing on my farm. It's relevant to changes about how we're trying to move this whole ag system in a different direction of doing all this, the soil health kind of stuff. Like Dave said, like all this stuff is wrong or difficult. It's easier to it's not wrong, it might be wrong. It's easier to give up than really try to push through a lot of this sort of stuff. There's a social and a contrarian aspect to a lot of this, right? There's social pressure about doing this stuff in a different way. There's a lot of, I think, pressure on folks trying to do something differently that they are doing it the wrong way. So I think it's important to keep this in mind, I think, as we talk about all these different pieces of the fact that it's really difficult to go down these paths, and nobody thus far has a lot of the right answers on it. This is kind of where we've fallen into on our farm, I guess. This aspect of the regen ag sort of stuff, we're not necessarily living each one of these principles like to the fullest extent, but I think this is an image from General Mills. I do think it's useful though to think about how we're trying to address some of these issues and what we're trying to do on the farm. And I find it's an easy graphic to conceptualize for those that don't deal with this every day of where we're going here, right? So these principles of minimizing soil disturbance, maximize crop diversity, keep the soil covered, living roots all year long, and livestock. So some background then on what we're trying to do. So we've got a 500-acre old vegetable farm. So we had a lot of years through the 80s and 90s of growing cucumbers and peppers, mint, tomatoes. Outside of the mint, a lot of crops, though, that had very little residue, and we just beat the crap out of the ground, right? Heavy tillage. We're on sandy loams and muck soils. We've unknowingly, in the 80s, just burned out a lot of the organic matter in those sandy loams. We've been speeding up the process of organic matter decomposition on those organic soils, and they're starting to get a little more rolling. They're not as uniform muck everywhere as they used to be. We're still dealing with upwards of 40 to 60% organic matter in spots, but it makes it really difficult to manage those soils now, particularly when we've eroded out the fields in so many ways. And you've got some places with 30, 40% organic matter, and 300 feet away, it's down to 2% organic matter. So how do you build a system? How do you manage that in a way that you can adequately do all of it? So I started running the farm then in 2012. And in many ways, it's a great time to kind of be thrust into the farm of having to manage everything because grain prices went through the roof. So I think at that time I was just finishing my PhD. I'd gone to work at Soybean Checkoff. So I've got an off the farm income, income, but all this obligation of, a 40-hour 9-to-5 job off the farm. So the priorities then on some level became trying to maximize productivity and cutting out field operations, trying to make things go quicker, and this idea that when grain prices are high, that we're going to invest in some capital improvements here so that when grain prices inevitably go down, we've lowered our cost of production. Hopefully the fact that we can maintain profitability a little bit. So we transitioned away from chisel plowing and field cultivating everything. We got a strip till unit. We paired it up with a Montag fertilizer box, so no more broadcasting nutrients. Everything's banded. And really coming out of school, I mean, it's all about increasing, right, efficiencies and all these sorts of things. The strip till unit we used for 4 years, 5 years or something like this, and it spent 2 years in the back of the barn, and we haven't pulled it out. Frankly, it's for sale if anyone's interested. I always kind of thought it was going to be at some point we'll transition to no-till, and it might be kind of a bridge out of conventional till. I hadn't planned on the change happening as quickly as it did. The strip till system was useful in a lot of ways. We'd paired it up with the twin row planter, so we'd gotten rid of the old, worn out John Deere planter and moved over to a Great Plains twin row planter. We started twin rowing covers in the fall on soybean stubble, and that worked out really well from the fact that you could come back in, strip till in between the twin rows of cover, and keep some living roots there into the spring. And if anything, then it becomes an easy way to start no-tilling into covers of you don't have any cover crop where you're actually trying to plant the crop. So they're still green in the field, but you're not dealing with the whole trouble of having to significantly reset the planter. You're still planting into conventional till at that point. It was useful on the muck soils of the problem on the muck, and I don't know if many of you have muck over this way. If it gets dry at all, the whole thing just blows and pushes, and it's just a bear, right? Well, as soon as we started getting cover crops on it, it started holding everything together. And we were strip tilling some of, a lot of the muck ground. And it quickly became a point that we were running the strip till unit over it just for the nutrient banding aspects of it. And a couple of years in, we got away with that. We just started putting a little bit more fertility with the planter. But it became kind of this bridge until doing something a different way. It's also increased resiliency a lot on the farm of how much we can do of dealing with namely too much rainfall in the spring. And Dave talked about how he's not carrying crop insurance anymore because it just doesn't pay. This was in 2018. We were caught up in the same thing that I'm certainly they were in southeast Michigan, and I'm sure it made it over this way. Just way too much rain, kept raining and raining during planting. This was in the first week of June. It was raining somewhat planting this field. It rained more later in the day. Honestly, we probably just should have pulled the plug and you just take your prevent plant and you go down, you'd call it quits. Well, we had enough cover crops out in the field that it held the planter up. You could plant into the rain. The yield was respectable. It's probably around average for us. But it got to be a point too, thinking of the fact that the more covers we're keeping into the system, the easier the management is for all these other things. And it becomes this aspect that maybe we don't need crop insurance in the same way. You don't need the prevented planting. All these other benefits kind of start to come around with this. So it's been pretty easy then to get cover crops into the system after soybeans, right? You just come in and you plant some either twin row, a winter cereal or a blend in the fall. The previous picture we'd just broadcast some rye in I think close to December. So giving cover crops after the beans has been a pretty easy thing. But it's been a lot more difficult then to get the cover crops into the corn. So we've tried a number of different ways of going about this, and the idea too here is it's easy to get the rye in. You can broadcast rye in December and it's still going to be green, at least in the spring. There'll be something there. But if we want to get any sort of a more diverse mix, if we want to get more diversity in the system, it's probably going to have to be planting into June. I've tried a lot of different ways of broadcasting different things over the top when we're outside dressing. And I've had lousy luck getting anything to establish in June into corn until we actually started direct seed placement. And planting seeds and treating cover crop in some ways like a cash crop. It hasn't been the easiest transition, and I don't think you could necessarily take this system and just go next year and start doing it, because the herbicide management becomes really difficult. Now, if you want to just plant a single species, something like just a grass out there or just a legume, then it becomes a lot easier. But if you want diverse species blends, then you got problems because all the herbicides kill everything. MSU and other academic organizations have come out with guidelines of some products that do pretty well for a bunch of different things. What we've settled on is, and this is too much glyphosate in the system, and I hate this, but there's so few options that have zero residual into the system. We're burning down in the spring with glyphosate, some Diflex, which is like a safe in dicamba, and like a half pound or a third of a pound of atrazine, just a little atrazine in there. Then coming back a day or two before, we're going to interseed another shot of glyphosate for the grass and Bucktrill for the broadleaves. It does not get 100% of the weeds. It gets 98%. But we have had good luck with everything else coming up, and it's been a system that works. The reason I say that I'm not sure that going directly into that the first year would work well is in this no-till system that we've got anymore, we're just not getting the weed emergence in the same way that we used to. And a lot of it's stopping the soil disturbance, right? We're not running row cleaners on the planter. We're running cast wheels now because I want to minimize soil disturbance behind the planter as much as possible. Bare dirt is just weed seed germination. So it's this idea of trying to make sure that keep the weeds out as much as possible, but don't let them get started in the first place either. I've played around with a lot of different blends, though, of what we're trying to do here. I don't have this right by any means. I've started doing a little bit more, like with the Haney test and some of these things, and I don't know if that's... I wish it was more prescriptive, that somebody could just tell you that here's your soil, that's what you need to plant for cover crop blends, but it doesn't work that way. So we're trying a lot of different things. I've followed the advice of some other guys that have been in this game a lot longer than I have of just take whatever like your budget is for the cover crop, for planting the cover crops, and just divvy it up between all the seeds. If it's $15 an acre, then just have all your seeding rates down to where it's affordable. Just get a lot of different stuff out there. This last year, we've shifted away a little bit more from the summer annuals, just because I want more green stuff out there in the fall, and I want more green into the winter. I want living roots all year long, and I'm not positive on how much some of those summer annuals that will get established under the corn canopy, and they're kind of there, but they're gone by this point of the season. I'm not sure how much that's doing for us. We're running planter units like this. They're old John Deere 7 or Maximerge 2 units. The nice thing with this is we're using one of those seed-right seed discs for the large seed, and you can just put the clovers and the little stuff in the insecticide boxes in the back and just dribble it in between the closing wheels. Tends to work pretty well for us. So a couple of pictures here of then what this looks like. This really draws out planting season, though. I mean, it's kind of a pain. Like, it never ends. Like, as soon as you get done planting, like, corn and beans, then you're turning around and trying to make sure you're spraying the second shot, the post-emerge herbicides before the corn gets too big, and then you got to get right back out there with the planter and be out there. It's just a lot of stuff going on all the time. We're running all like 8-row equipment. It's scalable, right? You can run 12-row, 16-row. It just becomes a lot more money. For like that interseed planter, like that's junkyard kind of material stuff, right? It's an old cultivator frame that we got for $500. It's an old Rawson hydraulic drive on there that we're screwed if the thing ever breaks down because you can't get parts for them anymore. But it is kind of like we're a 500-acre farm. We're not spending, tens and tens of thousands of dollars on doing some of this stuff. We're trying to build it on the cheap to make it affordable. So, and then this is, I don't know, this is mid-July probably. I don't have a date on this one. And this is one of the better spots, in all honesty. We've had a few drowned out spots from all those like 7-inch rains we started getting later into July. So we're not going to have green on everything coming up here. But with the mix there, there's enough kind of niches there that there's going to be a species kind of established in some way on something. We're running buckwheat into these, but it's been pretty successful, and I think we're kind of getting in the right direction on a lot of it. And then this is what this looks like in the spring. A couple challenges with this. We've been too heavy in the past, I think, in annual rye. And so Dave talked about a little bit the challenges with that. It's worked okay for us. It's green. It's got a wonderful root system on it. The problems are, though, several. I've never really had a ton of trouble killing it. But it doesn't get very big. It is not proliferating across the whole soil surface. I'm getting to the point where I want living roots across the whole field, not just in these narrow 30-inch bands where we interseeded the year before. And what we're doing with specifically corn stalk management is we're shifting over, after soybeans, we're shifting over 30 inches or 15 inches and putting a twin row of beans or whatever we're planting over the top of the cover crop. For the ryegrass, with that clumping root nature, it becomes problematic. If we're planting really early soybeans, the ryegrass isn't big enough to cause much problem. But if we're coming in like with late soybeans or dry beans or something like this, the ryegrass is too big and it just causes too many problems. So we're trying to pull back a little bit on that. For big grasses into a mix like that, the barley's been working well. I think it gets up and gets growing a little bit earlier than wheat in the spring. It does a little bit better in an interseeded cover crop mix like that. I've been told the cereal rye is like it doesn't like the shade, it won't do well. But what we are starting to do a little bit too is come back with cereal rye in the fall, like over the top of that field, and so we're planting cover crops twice. But I think it's worth it if we're getting enough biomass in the spring. So I'll talk a little bit about then the relay cropping we're doing too, because that's, especially this year, looks really good, so it's fun to talk about. But that's been, in 2013 or 14, I think, we started getting wheat back into the rotation. And again, this idea of, just more diversity. We've got to get away from just corn and soybeans. We'll try some different stuff. And so we started planting wheat with a twin row planter. To do like 50 or 80 acres of wheat every year, I really don't want to go out and buy another drill and maintain another piece of equipment. So we just started planting it with the twin row planter. It works nice for establishment. That the wheat looks fantastic coming up. It's planted with the seed unit. It's the right depth. It's somewhat singulated. We've moved from a Great Plains planter to like a homemade built John Deere with precision units on it and everything. And the singulation on that is good. So we're getting nice, we're really cutting back wheat seeding rates with that. But in 2014 or so, we planted the first year of, I guess we can go to the next slide maybe. Yeah, that's what it looks like in the spring. So you've got this nice looking wheat here in the spring, but you've got this basically kind of lane out there you could be doing other stuff with. So I think the second year we planted twin row wheat like this, we came back in, like after we got done with all the real crops, and planted soybeans into here. And a couple of challenges with that over the next few years. I think around that fall, and I still remember, I think it was around Thanksgiving, somebody had posted pictures on Twitter of a guy in Wisconsin that was doing this relay cropping stuff. And cutting his wheat in the summer with a row crop head and these big beans. And I posted a video of some of the stuff we did on it. And this was a big lesson for me of the fact that the more you're willing to put out there about what you're doing, the more you get back of people telling you, offering advice for a system improvement. It builds the support network. And that information exchange both ways. So I quickly started getting plugged in with other guys doing these practices and folks that had done this longer than me. So I'm not trying to invent all this stuff by myself. A few things we've learned. And we can probably go to the next slide. Early planting is essential for doing something like this. And it's the biggest key to making the system work. All the other pieces are pretty easy. Herbicides are no-brainers. Like Affinity Broadspec has like a 2-week rotation restriction back to beans. And it doesn't need 2 weeks for that matter. So managing all of this becomes pretty straightforward. It's just whether you're willing to do the work. And the simplest question I have for guys that if they're interested in doing this, do you have the philosophy that you get to harvest this field twice or that you have to harvest it twice? And I'd say 90% of farmers have the idea that I would have to harvest this field twice, and I don't want to do it. I see it as the fact I get to harvest this field twice. Now, I'm planting this field twice. It takes more time. We're out here planting soybeans into this field before we do anything else, before we're planting corn. And it's been that management piece has been the real trick to getting this to work. Because if you're planting them in June, the wheat just sucks up all the moisture. And there's just nothing left. The beans come up, if they come up at all, and they'll just die. Because I've had beans come up and get 2 inches tall and just, that wheat during grain fill just sucks all the moisture. And I don't think we really notice that when it's just a monocrop field of wheat. But if you have something else out there you're watching, there's nothing left for it. So we've done a few things as we've gone down to get a little bit better with this. This interseed planter, so this is the same planter that we're planting soybeans in a relay system that we're doing the interseeded covers into corn. It's got a 3-point hitch that's just offset 15 inches. So the planter's a little unbalanced, and that 40-40 doesn't, it's at the maximum weight. But it's been a pretty easy kind of conversion here to make it work. You can't be driving on the wheat and tracking it all up with your planter or with your tractor. So you almost have to have some sort of a second planter to make this work. I think we've been able to increase our nitrogen efficiency because we're doing a better job of where we're planting nitrogen on the wheat. We've been operating on a 2-shot system here. So streamer bars over the top of the twins at green up, and then like a homemade Y-drop system back at just before flag leaf. So we're trying to keep the liquid nitrogen off the plant. We've started getting skinnier and skinnier with the nitrogen, and I wonder if we've gotten a little too far this last year. We had like 30 pounds of green up and 30 pounds at like the second application. And I think a couple things bit us this year. With as dry as it was through June, we would have been better off just putting it all up front and not screwing around with the second pass. But we either didn't have both of these factors. We didn't have enough up front, and we were too late with the second application. And combined with the drought, like our wheat yields were nothing special. We were running like high 50s, low 60s. And like that's not where I want to be with this at all. Long term, I figure we're seeing like a 10% yield reduction, something like that, with running these wide rows. We're making some of that back. We're able to get seeding rates down to like 1 million. We're cutting back on nitrogen. But I mean, we need to be up to 70s, 80s, something like this to really make, like wheat's a tough pencil in the first place. And so when you start taking the yield off, it makes it a lot difficult. However, okay, so this is cutting it. I'll talk about that in a second. Harvesting is not necessarily a huge problem. The guys that are really pros of this, they're doing row crop heads. These all crops, right? The spinning discs under there with the kind of the gathering belts. It lets you cut the wheat really low. But you have to start making other modifications, like spacing your combine tires out. And like that stuff, like wheel spacers are expensive. All this kind of stuff takes time. I've been still sticking with the idea, we've got these kind of crop lifter things from Flexi Finger that they clip to the cutter bar and they stick out in front and they just push the beans down. They work pretty well. I think they work better than just putting tile, like sections of tile over your cutter bar. But those aren't cheap either, and I think you could probably make something just at home that works just as well. You just have to make sure you push the beans down off the cutter bar, because when you get successful at this, the beans will be as tall as the wheat when you're out there to cut the wheat. And like it's a problem, but it's a good problem to have. But other than that, we just shift the whole combine over 15 inches, so you're just not actually driving on the soybeans. We're running like 30.5 floaters on this. So we're trying to run 30-inch tires down 30-inch rows that were planted like by hand without guidance. But the weight of your tire, right? It's not very much on the edge. And as long as the internode length on these beans from the first internode is like this tall on the soil surface. Like these beans get really leggy and wimpy just because they've seen shade their entire lives. So unless they get really tall, like this tall, like waist tall, they'll just kind of like bend over, and you don't see too much of a big hit to doing this. At some point, it becomes controlling costs and just like trying to figure out ways. We're not spending a bunch of money for a system that like this doesn't have the reliability of a full season soybean crop. But this year it rained, so they look good. We've had zero like yield on the soybeans before. They come up and they just die. If it's dry in August, or if it's dry in June and they get planted too late, they're just toast in the first place. 2 years ago, we harvested like 15 bushel beans just because it was so dry during August. If it's dry after you cut the wheat, the beans just sit there and just don't do much. This year, it's obviously rained and they look fantastic. Like they'll be into the 40s. Last year, we had a frost in like mid-September over our way, and we were going to have like 30 bushel beans, and it just killed them. We're planting a late season bean with the idea that you need that flowering window as long as possible. So whenever we do get rain, that there's flowers there so the beans can actually turn around and do something with them. The problem is you open yourself up at the end on frost and just taking the yield out of the beans. I'd put some different strips in this year of like a 2-1, a 2-4, and I think a 2-8 bean. And the 2-1s are like they're already going down, and they'll be like 15 bushel per acre beans. These would be like 40. So again, it's not a foolproof system by any means, but 40-some bushel of beans after like 58 bushel wheat is still going to, I think, pay pretty well this year. So the last part I'll talk about then is like our move the last couple of years to trying to do different alternative crops, and for a couple different reasons. One, I think that there's some marketing to be made and some value to be made extracting out like the quality of crops if we're growing them in a different way with the soil health kind of angle to it. And it's what Dave talked about of getting paid for the nutrient quality of your crops at some point. But I think people are increasingly valuing where their food is grown and how their food is grown. So I do want to get into like a section of our farm at least actually growing food and not just cattle feed, because I think there's some value there. It's also like a path for profitability for a smaller farm like ours of just 500 acres. Largely like within the ag system today, the only way you grow your farm is to add more acres. And there's all kinds of negative aspects to that, I believe. It inherently puts you in competition with your neighbors. It's just this inevitable chase of just greater and greater production efficiencies and simply controlling costs, because nobody cares about the quality of the crop that comes out the back end. So we're trying to do some different things of growing different crops and building some marketing around them and trying to go after some of these farm market stores that are increasingly popping up and going into like Ann Arbor Market, Metro Detroit, some of those sorts of things. So last few years we've tried to do dry beans. There's some really agronomic advantages to these, I think. We're not planting them until June, so we can actually get some cover crop growth in the spring. I think that's going to help our system long term. One of the challenges with doing the relay cropping with the beans is we're now growing soybeans after the wheat instead of a cover crop. And like big picture, like the cover crop would do the soil more good. The beans might be like a short-term, economic jolt. But I am concerned of the fact that we're kind of giving up that window of like really spurring on soil health. So maybe the dry beans are a good complement to that. We're not planting them into June, so we get good cover crop growth. They're coming off early. The beans we've got now, we've harvested a few of them. The rest will probably be on another week, something like that. It should help our wheat yields because the last few years it seems like we're trying to plant wheat in late October, and I think that's hurting our yields on that. So the idea here too is if we can actually build like a better market for these, I think there's potential there. We're growing mostly blacks, just contracted, going up to the thumb. It's a long way up there, but it's dollars and cents once it goes on the truck. If the value's there, they can truck the things to Texas for all I care if it still works out economically for me. So it's production contracts. We're kind of learning our way through it. We're growing them no-till, planted green, all the ways you're absolutely not supposed to do this. This is going to be kind of a break year for us. Last year that our yields weren't great, like 12, 15 bags per acre, which is okay, and it was competitive probably with soybeans. But it's not where we need to be. And I'm not sure how much of that was the fact we're just dry last August, or I'm a bad dry bean farmer, or we're just not well suited for this area anymore. But I mean, there's a history of edible bean production down here. There shouldn't be a good reason why it doesn't work. There's no excuses this year for the environment factor on this, so we'll see what they look like this year. We are planting these green. We haven't made an awful lot of modifications to really what we're doing with the planter. We've toyed around with what we're going to do with crimpers. And this idea, I don't want to make multiple passes through the field if I don't really have to. We could very well get a 20-foot drum roller and the crimper the way you're supposed to do it. But we've been playing around with this idea. We put this unit together of another old cultivator frame and some double rolling baskets that we found from a guy up by Williamston. Last year, not this year and a half ago, yet last year, we'd done the same sort of thing of planting dry beans into some standing cereal rye, and we just borrowed a roller crimper from the neighbor and rolled it over after we planted, and it did pretty well. So it gave me a little bit of hope that maybe a system like this works. It's one pass through the field. The rye here was probably too early, really, to be crimping. But it got to be the point that we're just going to go with it. We're doing our herbicide program on this is completely modified because all the dry bean herbicides are meant to be incorporated. And if you get too high on the rates and they're not incorporated, I'm told, the beans get like brittle and they'll all break off. So we're doing a bunch of, it's all the P herbicides, right? Prowl, Pursuit, all this kind of stuff. And we're using Gramoxone as a burn down. I hate using Gramoxone. I don't want to use it from all the health reasons that go along with it. I think there's something to that. But there's just no options on this stuff. The glyphosate is an absolute taboo issue, like if we're going to try to go into a consumer market. When I get the forms from the farmers market stores asking me, like, what did I do? The only herbicide they care about is glyphosate, right? I could have poured paraquat onto the beans before I brought them to them. They don't care. No glyphosate. So I thought we were going to kind of have a mess with this because it knocked down a bunch of the rye, but it didn't crimp it. And so we're not getting the weed suppression. Yeah.
Do you have down pressure on that, or is that just the weight for your baskets?
It's just the weight, right? So there's no down, like we can control like the tipping of it a little bit, but no, there's no real down pressure on it. Yeah. Which would be like, that's the thing, is to start adding weight. At the same time, like that's a lot of weight out from that, in front of that tractor. So I hate to start adding a ton more weight to it and the axle breaks or something. Yeah, then we've got problems. I was wondering if we're going to have to come back and mow it or something. Like it all fell down. Like it crimped it back enough. I think that the paraquat just like destroys the cell structure. Like 3 weeks later, like wind had come through, knocked all of it down. It looks fine today. Like no problems. I have no idea what the next slide is. Oh, this is rolling it down. In good areas of the field, it did do a nice job. It really crimped it down. So there's a little bit more work here to do with, I think, for us of playing around with the specific cereal rye seeding rate in the fall and things like that. I've been scared of rye from the very beginning on doing any of this sort of stuff. And so I'm kind of slowly getting into it, and I'm going lower rates rather than higher rates. I'm sick of I do not want these stories that you can't get the planter in the ground because there's too much rye. But I would like to get to the point where we're getting some decent weed suppression out of it too. I've screwed up herbicides on it this year. Like we got behind in some stuff, and I went out there to spray like Reflex and Raptor, post on them, and the beans were already blooming. So like that's off the table. We have mare's tail out there. So like last year I didn't desiccate them. Like figured the frost took them out a bunch. And we're running an older 9500 combine. And there were enough green stems, they would get up the feeder house and start wrapping around that top feeder house drive and throw the feeder house chain off every like 5 acres. Like it was just a nightmare. It took like 4 days to harvest 70 acres of these things. We're killing the things this year and just being done with it. Because again, nobody cares if you put paraquat on them, I guess. So we are trying to build out some like messaging of what we're doing in farm stores with this sort of stuff. I'm in the Stockbridge farm store right now. We should be able to get in Chelsea and Ann Arbor this fall. The guys up in like Williamston and Mason won't call me back. But we're trying to put together a little bit of a story of why people should care about what we're doing with things differently. And I think this is something to think of too. If you have any inclination of like getting into like a market like this, I think telling a story and like giving a reason for people to care about what you're doing, I think is important here. I think pictures help. I really don't love this whole, like, we got to tell our story as ag. But I think like giving people a reason to care about what you do is worthwhile. People do care about where their food is being grown. Give them a reason to pay the exorbitant prices you're going to ask for this food. So we're going to try it. We're going to see whether it works. I don't know if we're ever going to build enough like volume to really make this kind of stuff work. But we're trying a few different crops. And at this point, we're kind of in the phase of throwing a bunch of stuff out there and see what works. And I think we had like 11 crops this last year. And in fairness, a lot of these were like 2 acres. Like we're just going to try it and see whether it works. We've got a couple acres of flax that we've harvested already. I've got a lot to learn on weed control about that. Chickpeas, evidently, I thought chickpeas were like dry beans because you just order them from the same guys and they're nothing like dry beans. I thought I screwed up and like we didn't plant them right or something because when they came up, they don't look anything like a bean plant. I don't think they work planting them at dry bean time. They need to be planted like in April because we're just going to toast them off because I don't think they're ever going to make seed. But we're playing around a number of different things here, and we'll see which of these things might actually work to kind of spin them up to something bigger. So, I'll wrap up with this, right? So you mentioned sunflowers, right? So we had some barley last year, and I'm happy to go down a rabbit hole and talk about barley contracts with somebody if they want to later. We are not growing it this year. Harvested off we had 20 acres of barley. We relay cropped half of it and did 10 acres of it just solid seeded because I wanted a price a comparison of what we're giving up for yield. So we baled some straw off, and then I think like the 1st of August planted 10 acres of sunflowers last year. And they go forever. One bag plants 10 acres. So we planted them. I wasn't really sure they were going to do much planted that late. They came up September-ish, and kind of in now. They were blooming. They were beautiful. And the birds came in and ate every single viable seed. Like it's amazing. Like every bird in the county was there. And there was nothing left to harvest. We tried it like in December, but they were punky and there's just nothing there. So we'll put a couple more acres in this year. For no other reason than I think if we're going to try to start selling some of the dry beans and some of these things in like local stores, putting in like an acre of sunflowers like builds this whole brand awareness for everything you're doing. So like we put a sign out next to them of like the farm name and like where the products are going to be this year. I think we'll keep doing this of just put like an acre of them in just for like all the social community benefits stuff. Same sort of stuff. There's a lot of wisdom there in like putting them in landlord mixes. We'll see whether they actually make it this year. Last year planted Pioneer sunflowers. This year I don't know what I planted because I put an order in with Pioneer and like 3 weeks later I was like hounding my seed guy like where are they? Like I need to plant them. Well the seed plant like took the order and then just didn't bother to send them and ran out and didn't tell anybody. So a buddy out of South Dakota sent me like a third of a bag of them that he had and we planted them. I don't know whether it's a different genetics, but like they didn't last the yellow parts of them didn't last as long, but the birds haven't been into them yet either. So we'll see whether we can actually harvest them. Heat? Well, that certainly helps. Yeah. I'm curious to see whether the birds get into them yet or not.
So did you sell your barley straw?
I haven't.
Do you know who wants barley straw?
Well, so this is my problem. Like I like growing some of this stuff better than I like marketing some of this sort of stuff. That's where we're going with. So I get busy with all these other projects, like the Michigan Ag Advancement stuff. And so we've got like 300 acres or 300 bales of barley straw sitting in a neighbor's barn. And this might be smart. I might have backed my way into this because nobody grew barley this last year. So we're going to have a market maybe next year. I need to get plugged up with like a pond maintenance company like out of Detroit and sell everything to them in one fell swoop. The local hardware stores will take it and will sell it for me, but it's like, I'm going to ask like $7 or $8 a bale and they want like 10 bales at a time. And it just becomes this thing of like, it's just not worth the time on some of these projects. I need to sell it all at once and just make it go away. But if anybody wants to buy barley straw, we can talk about that too. So with that, that's kind of all I have. I'm happy to talk about the stuff I'm doing. I know I'm going to stick around if you want to grab questions so we stay on time. But I'm happy to talk about like that underground innovation event or like other stuff we're trying to do with this new organization too. So, Sue, thank you.